Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Or perhaps you're used to forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. I've said those words since I was a little boy, and I'm sure most of you say them probably more frequently than any other prayer. And it's very easy to just say the words and not think about what they mean. I certainly didn't think a great deal about what they meant until I got to graduate school. In graduate school, my first professional pass was not in music at all, but in a very abstruse area of Slavic languages at Stanford. And one of the requirements of Slavic languages is that we had to learn the older language, which is the kind of mother language to the current Slavic languages, just as Latin is the mother language to Italian, Spanish, and French and Portuguese. So I was studying my Old Church Slavonic, as it's called, and I did have an advantage over many of the other students because I knew my Bible. And the way you study Old Church Slavonic is to read the Bible in that language. So I kind of knew what I was reading, but once in a while I would run into something that was kind of a head-scratcher. When I got to the Lord's Prayer, that was definitely a surprise to me because what I read didn't match up with what I'd been saying since I was a child. The words starting with "Give us this day our daily bread" are "Хлеб наш насущный дашь нам днес, и остави нам долги наши, як тоже и мы оставляем должникам нашим." And if we translate the end of that sentence literally, it says, "Forgive us our trespasses as we keep on forgiving those who trespass against us." It uses a form of the verb which we don't have in English, which makes a big deal out of the fact that we are keeping on doing it all the time. Now, keeping on doing it all the time for some things is easy, but forgiving others' trespasses that they make against us seems like a big job. And as I thought about that, and thought about it again for this sermon, I was reminded of the story in Matthew chapter 18, where Peter asks Jesus how many times he should forgive those who do him wrong. And he asks Jesus, should I forgive them 7 times? Jesus says, oh no, you should forgive them 7 times 7. Jesus saith unto him, I say not unto thee until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. That's a lot of times. And that's what that Slavonic word ostavljam means, over and over again, forgiving. Now, it's funny to me how modern science, and especially medicine, catches up with religion. And in this field of forgiveness, medicine is just now catching up with what Jesus said 2,000 years ago. And in case you haven't heard about it, there is a whole field in medicine called forgiveness training. Now, forgiveness training is not a biblical thing, although I'm sure you could turn it into that. The idea is that if you learn how to forgive people, your health improves. Now, obviously, Jesus was not telling Peter to forgive 70 times 7 so that he'd live longer or have a lower cholesterol level, but in fact, that is one of the payoffs. No less a medical school as Stanford University's medical school has had a professor named Carl Thoresen who's done research for years on what happens when people learn to deeply forgive other people. His work is with a cardiologist named Meyer Friedman, and the project, which has turned into a clinic, is called the Recurrent Coronary Prevention Project. The idea of it is that people who have had heart attacks stand a much better chance of not having a repeat heart attack if they learn how to forgive. Because in fact, the heart attack is very often connected to some kind of grudge that they hold or some kind of anger that they hold. And it's not just Stanford. Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore has a doctor whose name is Karen Swartz. And Dr. Swartz has formed a study clinic there which goes much further than the studies about heart attack. Her view of the whole thing with her clinic has to do with the ramifications for immune response, depression, heart disease, diabetes, and general stress levels. It's probably worth it that I quote a little bit of what Dr. Swartz says. Forgiveness is not just about saying the words, it is an active process in which you make a conscious decision to let go of negative feelings, whether the person deserves it or not. Swartz says, as you release the anger, resentment, and hostility, you begin to feel empathy, compassion, and sometimes even affection for the person who wronged you. Now, this does require training, and the training in forgiveness therapy has gone on also at a number of other places. If you're interested in this field, you don't need to hear me tell about it. You can just Google forgiveness training and you'll discover there's also a huge program at the Mayo Clinic. Now, if we go back to Dr. Swartz for a minute, we have a very interesting set of steps, not unlike the steps in the 12-step programs. And I'd like to just mention them to you so that you might think about these when you say the Lord's Prayer. She recommends that we start by reflecting and remembering. In other words, go back to the thing which involved your wrong, your feeling of being wronged. You have to revisit that so that you have a clear idea of what it is you're forgiving. Then, after you've visited it, you need to learn to empathize with the other person. This might mean that you think about why they did what they did, or what it was that made them do something that was so abhorrent to you. Then, the most important part, in my opinion, is that you forgive deeply. In other words, if you do this just to get your blood pressure down or to manipulate the other person, it isn't going to work. In fact, Dr. Swartz goes on to say, your relationship with the other person might actually be worse. So it's got to be sincere and it's got to be deep. Then you also have to decide that this is something that you yourself are doing. This is an action. This isn't just a thought. You have to do something. If you can't talk to the person who wronged you or you feel it's not safe, you can resort to writing in a journal or to go to someone else, maybe a therapist, a friend, a family member, and tell them that you have decided to forgive this person. And then comes the hardest part of all, forgiving yourself. Because if you've studied this really hard, you may realize that part of this process involved you being wrong also. So this brings me to the next and final point, that we need to think of wrongs in a much broader context these days. I don't know whether you keep track of things on the St. John's website, but I have a recommendation for you. If you haven't listened to Father Peter's exhortation about the coming election, please do take a look at that. It's a wonderful opportunity to reflect on how manners make the person. And in fact, one of the things that struck me in watching Peter's exhortation is that we are faced with the fact that we are dealing with people who wrong us because they're different. They hold a different opinion. They aren't part of what we think is right. This brings me to a story which my younger daughter shared with me Tessa is a dance teacher, and this is not ballet, but social dancing. And Tessa has a very difficult job because she has to face people, literally, and teach them to dance when she may not agree with their views. Political, she may not like the way they act, but they're clients, and so she has to tolerate their otherness, and she has to deal with it in a professional way. So Tessa dealt with this by writing a little piece on her Facebook page, and it's in the form of a parable. Now, I don't want to go on too long about the parable, so I'm going to just condense it for you, but if you're interested, you might want to go to Tessa Antolini's Facebook page and read the whole story. A little girl is given a violin by an old man, and the old man says, "This is a magic violin, little girl. I'm going to give it to you, and if you learn to play, you're going to learn a great deal more than music." And the little girl agrees, and then goes and asks people in the village, "Where could I find a violin teacher?" And someone suggests a man, and she goes to his house, and the man says, "What can I do for you?" And she said, "I want to learn to play the violin. I have this violin." And the man says to her, "Yes, I'll take you as a student, but you're going to have to really work hard and do what I say and understand that the things I tell you are right." And so the little girl says, "Yes, I'm ready to work hard. I'm a hard worker," and she starts immediately. And it's summertime, and her parents hear her practicing, and as time goes by, she finds that she's getting better and better, and eventually the parents notice it. And they say, "How are you doing so beautifully on the violin?" And she said, "Oh, I'm just learning." And they say, "No, somebody's got to be teaching you." And she finally admits that she's been going to this teacher. And they say, "Who is this teacher?" She identifies the person, and they say, "Oh, no, not that man. He's not one of us." Tessa's parable actually calls the village of belonging. And the violin teacher doesn't belong to their group. So they tell her she should have nothing more to do with this man because his ideas are wrong. The little girl is terribly upset because the man has shared with her something very valuable. So she eventually goes to him and she says, "I'm really sorry, but my parents tell me I shouldn't be coming here. I shouldn't be listening to you because you're not one of them." And he says, "What? They're those kinds of people? You shouldn't be listening to them. You should be listening to me as I've taught you." The little girl is terribly upset and goes back to the man who gave her the violin and says, "You really tricked me. How could I possibly have learned music and something else?" And the old man says to her, "It seems to me you already have." The little girl has to go for a long walk and realizes that what she's learned is not only to play the violin, but also to embrace different people's points of view and not exclude them. I'd like to conclude with a prayer you probably also know by heart by St. Francis of Assisi. "Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life." Amen.